The suffocating sense of breath being squeezed by cold soil, accompanied by the extreme pain of virulent poison corroding the organs, is the last memory from my previous life, the moment before death. The greedy, twisted face of the neighbor John next door, and his wife Sarah's sharp, cold laughter beside him, are like brands deeply etched into my marrow. They poisoned my dinner to paralyze me so they could, overnight, throw me into the abandoned deep pit in the back mountains, burying me alive with shovels of dirt. The despair and hatred as I watched the light gradually blocked by the soil and my lungs filling with sand burned to the extreme in the darkness. Yet, the fierce coughing suddenly pulled me back to reality. I jerked my eyes open, no suffocating soil, no pitch-black pit. Sunlight streamed through the bright glass window onto my hand, and the calendar on the table clearly showed the date. It was exactly 3 months before I was poisoned and buried alive. I had come back to life. I had been reborn to a starting point where all tragedies had not yet happened, where this pack of wolves was plotting to strip me of everything. I raised my hands. Between my fingers there was no dirt, only the hot blood violently surging through my veins. The killing intent almost burst from my chest, but I took a deep breath and forcibly pressed this overwhelming hatred back to the deepest point. Killing them outright would be too easy for them. I would let them claw their way to the top in their greed-filled fantasies, then personally pull them into an endless, bottomless abyss from which they could never escape. A sudden, urgent, rough knock interrupted my thoughts. I walked to the mirror and looked at the pale, but utterly cold face reflected there. I raised my hand, tousling my hair a bit, pulled the corners of my mouth down, and adopted a long-term expression of anxiety, fatigue, and craven weakness. I opened the door, and standing outside was John. He wore a muddy worksuit, tall and burly, with a smile that was hypocritical yet oppressive on his face. His eyes scanned the interior of the house behind me as quickly as an eagle, glinting with a hint of undisguised covetousness. "Hey, you don't look so good," John stepped forward, his massive body almost filling the doorframe and looking down on me. "I heard you've had big trouble with your funds lately. The farm machinery is broken and you can't pay to fix it, and that fertile land in the back hills is left to waste. Such a pity." I seemed to be frightened by his momentum, shrinking my shoulders slightly, my eyes wandering, avoiding his gaze, my voice trembling and helpless. "John. Yes, since my parents passed, I really can't manage alone. The bank loan is about to mature, and I can't even buy seeds for next season." Hearing my reply, the corner of John's mouth lifted into a tiny arc, a hunter's smug triumph when the prey falls into a trap. "Hey, we've been neighbors for years. I'm truly sympathetic seeing you like this." John pretended to sigh, patted my shoulder with a force that seemed strong enough to crush my bones. "If you want my advice, a girl like you can't possibly till the land. You hold such a vast, fertile patch of land, but it's a pure waste. How about this, you lease the land to me, or even sell it to me at a discount. I'll help you pay off the bank loan, and give you some living money. You can go live a comfortable life in the city, isn't that better? Here it comes." The same tactic as in my previous life. Out of trust for a neighbor, I hesitated and did not agree, and the result was their covert poison. I lowered my head, hands tightly clenched together, playing the role of a desperate, extremely distressed yet inherently timid orphan girl to the extreme. This is the only legacy my parents left me. I can't sell it," I said with a choked voice, then I looked up again, meeting his gaze filled with pleading and dependence. "John, can you lend me some money? Even a little, let me buy cheap seeds to plant this season, and after harvest I will pay you back with interest." John's face flickered with slight change, a hint of disgust and contempt flashing in his eyes. In his view, my current behavior was that of a fool still clinging to life while dying. Borrow money? The agricultural product market is so bleak right now, what could you plant that would make money? John scoffed coldly, waving his hand. "I don't have spare money to waste on you. But, as neighbors, I suggest you figure it out soon. On this land, without enough labor and capital, you won't even survive this winter." After speaking, he didn't bother with any courtesy, turned around, and swaggered toward his own house. Watching his departing figure, the softness and helplessness on my face vanished in a thousandth of a second, replaced by a frost-like stillness. I closed the door, drew the curtains, and walked to the innermost part of the study. In the bottom layer of the old safe my parents left, I uncovered a notebook hidden deep away. That was my father's confidential record from his years as a botanist on field expeditions. On one page of the file, there was a very special plant atlas attached. This plant superficially resembles a high-yielding, premium crop with a very short growth cycle. A few days after breaking ground, it would sprout lush branches, showing an astonishing disguised prosperity. But its roots would secrete a highly toxic acidic substance, not only permanently destroying the soil's microecosystem, turning the whole area into a barren soil for 10 years, but the toxin would also spread through the groundwater. Most importantly, this plant is strictly listed as a Category 1 invasive and ecological damage toxin under local law. Possessing and planting it privately would incur exorbitant fines and severe criminal liability. In my previous life, I treated this notebook as a normal scientific field record and locked it in the cabinet. Now, it will be my first guillotine tailored for John's family. I took out a slip of paper and clumsily wrote a fake special high-yield crop planting plan with my left hand, detailing the plant's extremely high economic returns and incredibly easy cultivation method, and attached a small package of seeds I had privately obtained earlier through special channels. I placed this slip of paper and the seed sample in a drawer that looked very hidden but was actually very easy to discover. The next morning, as the blinding sunlight finally broke through the clouds, a harsh roar from farm tractors suddenly exploded outside my yard. John was driving his huge land-clearing machine, deliberately grinding the tires along the fence of my yard, sending up mud that splashed all over my freshly trimmed flower beds. His wife Sarah wore neat farm work clothes, stood with her arms crossed by the car door, her sharp, petty eyes staring at me, a toothpick clenched in her mouth, a look of condescending ridicule on her face. I wore a faded old coat and carried a battered wooden bucket as I walked out of the house, my face briefly betraying alarm and helplessness. "John! Sarah! What are you doing?" I shouted as I ran toward them, my voice trembling. "Your machine damaged my fence." Sarah spit out the toothpick, hands in her pockets, casually stepping over the broken fence and straight to me. She pointed a finger and jabbed hard into my shoulder blades, with enough force to make me stagger back. "Damaged the fence? The boundary of this land has long been blurred. We're helping you clear the weeds," Sarah sneered, her eyes burning into me. "I heard you borrowed money from John yesterday?" "Don't dream about it. But for the sake of years of neighborly ties, I've brought you an agreement." She reached into her pocket and whipped out a crumpled sheet of paper, plopping it into my arms with a thud. It was a long-term land lease agreement, with rent so low as to be obscene, even less than a tenth of the market price. The terms were extremely harsh, stipulating that if I failed to deliver the land on time, I would be responsible for a massive default penalty. "Sign this," Sarah ordered in a commanding tone. "Sign it, and we'll immediately pay you the first advance, enough to cover this quarter's bank interest. If you don't sign, the bank's collectors will come this afternoon to foreclose on your house." I held the paper, my knuckles whitening from the grip. I looked up, my eyes full of humiliation and anger, my voice rising in pitch. "This is impossible. This is outright robbery. The market value of this land is 10 times higher than this." John then hopped down from the tractor, stomping heavily in the mud with a dull thud. He stepped around to my back, his massive shadow enveloping me completely. "The value is determined by the market, and now, in this area, only we are willing to take over your mess," John snarled, his rough hand landing on my shoulder, the weight making my legs go weak. "You can refuse, but trust me, you'll regret it." Faced with both of them pressing hard, I took a deep breath, and the stubborn defiance in my eyes gradually transformed into a madness and despair born of a trap in which I felt I had fallen. "Fine. You're forcing me, are you?" I ripped the lease agreement to shreds, the fragments scattering across the muddy ground. I glared at them, shouting aloud, "I don't need your charity. I won't lease the land to you. I've found a way to get rich." John and Sarah exchanged a glance, a moment of scorn and suspicion flashing in their eyes. A way to get rich? For you? Sarah let out a cold laugh, eyes full of contempt. With your little abilities, what path could you possibly find? I pretended to slip, my face suddenly changing, and quickly covered my mouth, my eyes scanning the surroundings in extreme fear, instinctively stepping back several paces to increase the distance between us. Nothing. I didn't say anything. I stammered, my steps rushing back toward the house. Anyway, I don't need your money. I will never give you this land. After speaking, I pretended to panic, turned and ran back into the house, slammed the door with a thud, and even locked the door from the inside. Through the gaps in the curtains, I clearly saw John and Sarah standing in the yard. John frowned, looked down at the fragments of the agreement on the ground, while Sarah narrowed her eyes smartly, her gaze fixed on the second-floor study window I had inadvertently exposed when I fled just now. The more intense my reaction, the more I tried to cover it up. With their greedy nature, they became more convinced that I held some unspeakable big-money secret. Half an hour later, I deliberately drove away from the farm in my ragged pickup truck, the engine roaring loudly, heading toward the town. In the rearview mirror, I saw John's SUV far behind for a stretch, and only after confirming that I had completely left the farm did he turn around and head back. They were hooked. During the 2 hours I was gone from the farm, John and Sarah, as I had expected, quietly infiltrated my house. The security clues I left showed that they headed straight for the second-floor study, rummaged through all the drawers, and successfully found the carefully forged planting plan and the special seed samples hidden at the bottom of a drawer. On that plan, I used very professional terminology and detailed data to outline a new imported cash crop called golden crown grass. The plan noted, a growing cycle of only 30 days, a yield 5 times that of ordinary crops, a very high market purchase price, and extreme drought resistance, making it highly suitable for that barren land up the hill. And at the end of the plan, I had also stamped a red seal stating top secret unreleased variety, prohibited from unauthorized dissemination. When I returned home in the afternoon, the drawers had been carefully reset after being rummaged through. The position of the plan had shifted by half a centimeter, and the seed samples in the drawer were reduced by exactly half. John and Sarah thought they had obtained the ultimate password to become rich, but they did not realize that they had taken from the drawer a weapon that would sever all their family's retreat. Not long after, Sarah shamelessly came to my doorstep again. This time, the arrogance on her face had cooled a lot, replaced by an unmistakable mixture of excitement and test. "Hey, I was rude just now." Sarah smiled and handed me a box of baked goods. "We're all neighbors, no need to make things so tense. Shall we discuss the land issue again?" I stood behind the door gap, looking at her coldly, my eyes full of vigilance and hostility. "There's nothing to discuss. Please leave." Seeing my guard, the greed and pride in Sarah's eyes nearly spilled over. In her view, my stubborn secrecy finally confirmed the authenticity of the plan and the seeds. "Well, since you're so stubborn, I won't push it," Sarah shrugged, turned and left, her steps fast as if she were walking on clouds. "Based on your instructions, I have strictly followed the outline of Chapter 3, when pretending to yield, using leverage to break the deadlock, and kept the narration entirely in the first person, with no protagonist's inner monologue, an independent character profile, and absolutely no sequel fabricated rush. Here's Chapter 3 content. On the third day after obtaining the seeds and the plan, John and Sarah did not rush to act. Instead, they adopted a more insidious tactic. Early in the morning, a black luxury sedan parked at my courtyard gate. The door opened, and a middle-aged man with a refined suit and a protruding beer belly stepped out. He held a briefcase in his hand, wore a professional fake smile on his face, and walked into my yard alongside John and Sarah. "Let me introduce him, this is the town's most famous lawyer, David." John swaggered into the living room, plopping down on my sofa in the center, tapping the coffee table with his hand. "Today, Lawyer David is here to help us champion justice and clarify the ownership history of this land." Lawyer David pushed up his gold-rimmed glasses, pulled a thick stack of documents from his briefcase, and slammed them in front of me. According to the supplementary agreement on the initial division of this land from 30 years ago, and the recently updated Rural Geological Protection Act, there is a severe overlap in the property boundaries of the hillside parcel under your name. David spoke bluntly, cold and devoid of warmth. Meanwhile, your debt situation has triggered the compulsory seizure clause under local environmental protection and land management laws. Mr. John, as the largest operator of neighboring land, holds statutory priority of compensation and property takeover rights. This was a forged document with historic signatures. A loophole-riddled coercive agreement. They had brought in the notorious bully of a lawyer, David, precisely to exploit my lack of legal knowledge and cowardice, and to use legal means to sweep me off this land. I sat in the chair opposite, my body slightly trembling, my eyes full of fear and despair. This is impossible. This land was legally inherited by my parents. You're forging documents. I protested sharply, my hands gripping the edge of the table tightly. Sarah sneered, walked to David's side, and looked down at me from above. Forgery? This has the notarization seal of the town court. If you think it's fake, you can appeal and sue. But lawyer David's hourly fee is $800, and you can't even come up with $80 right now. John clenched his fists, his joints crackling. Girl, don't say I didn't look after you. Sign now, and I can privately compensate you with $5,000 in cash. If you don't sign, once the court issues the enforcement order, you won't get a penny, and you'll have to bear the late land rent penalties for these years, and you'll end up in prison. The three of them echoed each other, pushing a paper filled with a dead-end agreement into my hands. I lowered my head, tears welling in my eyes, completely softened in the chair as if all my willpower had been completely crushed at that moment. Fine. I'll sign. But I have one condition. I spoke with a sob, in nearly pleading tones. I can assign the hillside wasteland to you right away, but the house and the front yard land must remain mine, and you must give me at least a month to move out. During this month, you cannot harass me, and I will not interfere with any disposal of the hillside land by you. John and Sarah exchanged a glance, and triumph flashed in their eyes. The hillside land was precisely the best planting area for the golden crown grass they saw in the plan. They worked hard to obtain this fake agreement, and their entire goal was the hillside wasteland. No problem. It's a deal. John eagerly handed me the pen, afraid I would back out. With trembling hands, I wrote on the written supplementary clause of the agreement to consent to transferring the use rights of the mountainous plot and to promise not to interfere for a month, then signed my name. Holding the signed document, John and Sarah laughed until their mouths couldn't close, and with attorney David they swaggered off. However, within half an hour after they left, I washed away my disguise, slipped into a plain black outfit, and exited the house through the back door. I headed straight to the town post office and sent a package filled with evidence to the city environmental enforcement team as well as to John's biggest business rival, the Foster Group, which is also developing large-scale agriculture locally. The contents of the package included secretly collected reports showing John repeatedly changing land use and illegally using excessive pesticides in recent years, as well as a copy of the land transfer supplementary agreement signed by attorney David that contained serious legal loopholes and tax evasion risks. Moreover, just half an hour earlier, I anonymously submitted a request for autonomous mediation of land boundary disputes to the local land court. Legally, once the mediation process is initiated, any party carrying out large-scale tilling, transformation, or illegal crop planting on the disputed land during this period will be directly deemed as destroying disputed assets and intentional illegal business operation. And the prevailing party will bear double criminal liability. John and the thug lawyers they hired thought they could lock me in with a fake contract, but they had no idea that the supplementary agreement I signed, along with the prearranged legal mediation petition I set up in advance, had already become a heavy shackle that tightly bound around their necks. After obtaining temporary use of the hillside plot, John and Sarah could hardly wait even a day. At midnight, the quiet countryside was broken by the deliberate but still oppressive roar of a diesel engine running. I kept the lights off and went barefoot to the dark room at the end of the second-floor hallway. Here, a high-definition camera setup with ultra-telephoto focal length and infrared night vision was already in place, its lens fixed squarely on the black land behind the hills. Through the night vision screen, I could clearly see the iron gate of the neighboring farm being quietly pushed open. John was driving a tracked-heavy tiller with its headlights off, slowly entering the hillside fields that belonged to me, under the moonlight. Sarah wore a dark hooded raincoat, carrying 2 large plastic buckets, following the machine. Behind them were 2 of John's relatives, a few people moving stealthily and with extremely quick, furtive motions. Move faster! Till this piece of land all over with deep tilling. John's lowered voice drifted faintly with the night wind, filled with unrestrained excitement. Don't make too much noise, that fool next door is sleeping like a dead pig, but we still have to be cautious. Sarah's sharp, high-pitched laughter pierced the darkness. What are we afraid of? Even if she wakes up and sees it, so what? The agreement is signed. This land is now under our control. Hurry and sow those golden crown grass. Once it matures next month, we'll be rich. The tiller's steel teeth dug hard into the fertile soil, tearing with a soughing sound and flipping wet, black earth into clumps. John's family, to prevent my backing out or seizing the initiative, even disregarded the taboo that deep tilling could damage the soil structure in high moisture conditions at night and forcibly tilled deeply. I stood behind the camera, coldly watching the scenes recorded on the screen. The night vision lens captured John's facial details clearly, his eyes glittering, his facial muscles twitching slightly from extreme greed. Sarah efficiently opened the plastic buckets, spreading large quantities of the poison seeds of the golden crown grass that had been hidden in my drawers, layer by layer into the freshly turned deep troughs. They had no idea that, in order to ensure this land left undeniable evidence of contamination, I had already buried soil sampling markers with GPS coordinates and timestamps at the 4 corners of the hillside plot over the past 3 days. Not only that, the camera's digital storage card was live uploading a high-definition video with precise time, geographic position, and infrared spectral images to a cloud server, encrypted in real time, and automatically generating tamper-evident electronic blockchain notarization seals. In the eyes of the law and environmental agencies, at this moment they were not operating a farm but illegally occupying someone else's disputed assets without final land ownership settlement, and secretly sowing unknown dangerous organisms. Boom! The tiller crashed into the boundary marker I had placed earlier near the edge. John didn't bother to get out to inspect. Instead, he laughed wildly and slammed on the accelerator, crushing the boundary marker and seizing even more of my land, extending halfway an acre further in. Nice and easy. John shouted, "Tomorrow morning, we'll go to town to apply for an agricultural loan, saying we've contracted a large, high-yield base and replace all the machinery with the latest models." Yes. Fill this land to the brim. By the time that dead girl realizes it, it'll be a done deal, and she'll have no evidence to pull up, Sarah agreed from behind, pouring the last barrel of poison seeds into the soil, chasing after the so-called high yield, with sowing density twice that of normal crops. They greedily plowed and sowed, thinking they were burying the hope of sudden wealth, unaware that they were using their own hands to dig a giant grave for their entire family. Those deeply buried venomous seeds, as the tiller compressed the soil, had already taken root in the very lifeblood of this land. At 3 a.m, the hillside finally quieted again. John's family, covered in dirt and exhaustion, tiptoed back into their yard, pretending that nothing had happened. I walked to the table and pressed the stop button on the camera. The screen showed that the entire 3 hours of illegal occupation, defacement of the border monument, and illegal sowing had been recorded without a blind spot. I properly backed up the video files, then drew back the curtains and looked at the hillside behind us, ruined and chaotic, yet sown with poisonous seeds. I slowly raised my hand and, toward the blackened house next door, saluted with a cup of iced water from afar. Thanks to the deadly growth instinct of the special poisonous plants and the overdoses John and his family sowed, astonishing phenomena appeared on the hillside after only 10 days. The originally barren black soil sprouted dense, tender green seedlings. They rose from the ground at a pace visible to the naked eye, reaching over half a meter within just half a month. The stalks were thick, the leaves wide and glossy, and from a distance the entire hillside looked as if it had been covered with a thick, luxurious green carpet, presenting a nearly eerie prosperity. This miracle utterly confused John and Sarah. In the morning, I pushed a shabby bike out wearing a soiled old work outfit, half empty and disoriented. At the neighbor's gate, a group of local farmers summoned by John had already gathered. John, in a brand-new expensive cowboy outfit, with a cigar clenched between his teeth and his limbs flailing, boasted loudly about his high-yield crop. Sarah wore a designer dress and held a delicate Dell laptop, continually showing others the so-called long-term futures contract data. When they saw me pushing the bike by, John shouted at me, vanity and contempt spilling from his eyes. "Hey! Who do we have here?" John laughed, pulling a nearby farmer's shoulder, pointing at me and sneering loudly, "Isn't this the big farmer of our town? What, can't even afford gas for a beat-up pickup? Want me to lend you 10 yuan to take the bus?" A few sycophantic farmers nearby joined in the laughter. I lowered my head, parked the bike at the roadside, fumbled with my clothes with my hands, my gaze wandering, my voice barely audible. "John, the land on the hillside grows really well. I've hardly had a meal lately, the bank's interest is pressing hard. Could you advance part of the compensation for the land that you promised before?" Seeing me so humbly pleading, Sarah walked over in her high heels with disdain. She looked down from above as she extended a hand, pulled a stack of thin cash from her designer bag, and in front of everyone, flung it onto my face like she was giving alms to a stray dog. The scattered banknotes splashed onto the muddy ground. "Take it, $3,000, don't spend it all at once." Sarah sneered acerbically, "If I weren't considering our neighbor's sake, you wouldn't even get this 3,000. Look at this land, under our control it'll become a money mountain in less than a month. In your hands, it's just a piece of waste paper. This is the gap between vision and ability." I remained silent and, in front of everyone, bent down, picked the money from the muddy ground one by one, wiped the mud off painstakingly, and acted out an utterly crushed, survival-necessitated, humbled underdog to the extreme. Yet, from an angle they could not see, my eyes were ice-cold. This kind of false prosperity is precisely the fatal flaw of the poisonous plants. In the first 20 days of breaking ground, they voraciously absorb nutrients from the soil's surface, showing unparalleled vitality, but once their main root system penetrates the soil surface and touches the deep rock and underground water veins, a highly acidic toxic corrosion will erupt fully. And now, this is the best moment to lure them into staking all their assets on the table. After picking up the money, I looked up and, with a gaze full of envy and flattery toward John, said, "John, can the stuff in this land really be sold for a lot of money? If I want to invest more, where should I borrow the money from?" Hearing this, John and Sarah's eyes lit up instantly. They were worried that their funds were not enough to expand planting scale and build a supporting rough processing factory. In their view, if even I, a fool, could be tempted to borrow money for investment, it meant the project's allure was irresistible. Borrowing money? Easy. John patted his chest and shoved a business card into my hand. A financial intermediary loan company in town. As long as you mortgage your property title, they can approve hundreds of thousands. But with your nerve, you probably won't dare borrow. I held the card, feigning both interest and extreme fear, and meekly retreated back into my house. Of course I wouldn't borrow, but John would. That afternoon, I learned through an undercover channel that John had completely fallen into a trap. In order to swallow the subsequent thousands of acres of the Golden Crown grass supply chain, John not only mortgaged his entire existing farm to that lending company, but even persuaded his relatives to pledge all the family savings, pensions, and 3 houses, amassing a colossal fund of $2 million, which was poured entirely into the construction of the rear hillside facilities and the procurement of the second batch of poison seeds. And that seemingly legitimate financial lending company, its actual funding backer hidden behind the scenes by several layers of offshore shell companies, was me. Every asset they mortgaged, every high-interest loan contract signed, and every creditor ultimately belonged to me. In the evening, heavy construction machinery roared from the hillside. John was cutting trenches and digging deep pits in a grand fashion, preparing to build large irrigation channels and storage facilities. 20 days have passed, and the patch of golden crown grass on the hillside has grown almost to 1 meter tall, its dense leaves gleaming with a strange deep purple luster. The John family is immersed in the illusion of sudden wealth, completely unaware that danger has erupted along the underground water veins. That morning, a screeching shout erupted from the neighboring farm, shattering the quiet of the countryside. I donned a plain old outfit, opened the back door, and stood by the fence watching coldly. I saw Sarah hadn't even tied her shoes properly, panic written all over her face as she barged out of their core livestock shed, tumbling through the mud, crying out in a choked voice, "John! Help! Something big has happened!" John dashed out in his pajamas, followed by several long-term workers they had hired. A few people rushed into the livestock shed, and in less than a minute, angry, desperate roars from John rang out. I stood above, seeing clearly enough. The 30-odd premium cattle that John had invested heavily in were now all scattered and collapsed in the manure ditch, mouths foaming, limbs convulsing, veins turning a frightening black. In just a few minutes, several adult bulls that were still gasping for air had completely fallen silent, and the entire shed was filled with a strong stench of filth and blood. This was the inevitable result once the roots of the golden crown grass matured. Its highly acidic toxic secretions penetrated the topsoil and completely seeped into the underground water table. And John, in order to save money, used deep well water for both the shed and his own living area. How could this happen? It was fine yesterday. These cattle are worth hundreds of thousands. Sarah collapsed to the mud, slapping her thighs as she cried, trembling like corn silks in a gale. John's eyes turned red, grabbing the neck of a worker like an enraged beast and shouting, "Check it. Test it. Is the water the problem? Or did that bitch next door poison our cattle?" The several workers shivered and immediately diverted well water for reagent testing. The moment the test strip dipped into the well water, the previously pale yellow strip turned black within a thousandth of a second, even releasing a pungent corrosive gas that melted a hole in the plastic test cup. John was utterly stunned. He stared hard at the inky black toxin water, his face from red to white, finally turning a corpse-like gray. What filled him with despair was that the toxins spread far exceeded all imagination. In less than half a day, not only the livestock shed but also the water from John's master bedroom faucet began to turn yellow and foul, with a strong metallic rust odor. The entire family, having used well water for washing and cooking that morning, now suffered severe nausea, vomiting, and skin ulcers, with red patches frighteningly appearing on Sarah's cheeks. They frantically sought for the cause, yet refused to believe that the source was the very prosperity grass they so boasted about. While the John family was at their wits' end, blaming one another, I had already donned sterile protective gear, armed with professional soil and water sampling equipment, and had aseptically sealed samples of the strong acidic leakage around the toxic plant roots on the hillside, samples from the contaminated well water at John's house, and tissues from the contaminated dead cattle. I packed these legally potent samples in urgent seal bags and had them delivered directly by special courier to the State Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and to the National Geological and Ecological Safety Investigation Bureau at a special reporting window. Moreover, I anonymously forwarded the sampling data to the local news television station. In today's era of extremely stringent environmental protection laws, a major geological-ecological contamination and toxin leakage triggered on private land is an untouchable red line that cannot be erased. In the afternoon, John charged to my door like a maniac, slamming my front door with all his might, the flesh on his hands rotting away from contact with the poisonous water. "Come out! You bitch! Did you tamper with things in the fields?" John roared outside the door, his feet stomping the door panels. I opened the window and looked down on him, my face displaying just the right amount of terror and innocence. "John, what are you talking about? Your cow died, what does that have to do with me? That plot behind the hill has always belonged to you all for tilling and managing. I've never even set foot there." The words hit him like a hammer, smashing hard into John's chest. He shuddered, gazing at the hillside overgrown with golden crown grass, its roots deeply embedded in the vein of the earth, and a fear previously unimaginable rose from his spine. He finally realized that the riches-bringing miracle he had longed for was actually a group of venomous demons that had already opened their bloodthirsty mouths to him. The sky darkened somehow, and a heavy rain poured down, washing the toxins on the poisonous plant leaves deeper into this land. The ear-splitting siren shattered the quiet after the rural storm, as 5 law enforcement vehicles bearing the words State Environmental Protection Agency and Ecological Crime Investigation Division roared into the neighboring John's farm. Behind them came 3 TV news vans and a large contingent of armed joint enforcement officers. The thunderous roar and flashing police lights drew the entire village's residents to the fence. John and Sarah, wearing hospital gowns, their faces reddened and ulcerated from exposure to toxic water, ran out of the house in a panic. Seeing the courtyard full of officers and the long guns and the cameras, John's knees buckled, nearly dropping to the ground. A tall, stern-looking chief investigator from the Environmental Protection Agency stepped forward, flashing the emergency seizure and criminal investigation orders, his voice cold and all-encompassing. "Mr. John, M.S. Sarah, we received an urgent report and after sampling tests, it has been confirmed that your farm and the hillside plots contain an extremely dangerous prohibited toxic plant, golden crown grass, and the toxin it secretes has caused irreversible contamination of the regional deep underground water veins. According to the State Ecological Safety Act, you have been placed under investigation." Hearing the words criminal investigation and irreversible contamination, Sarah screamed on the spot, her eyes rolling back as she fainted into the mud. John's eyes reddened, and like a madman he leapt up, pointing at me as I came out and hysterically roared at the enforcement officers, "It wasn't me. Officer. I'm being wronged. This back hillside land belongs to that bitch. The seeds are hers. Everything is hers. She's the one setting me up. If you're going to arrest someone, arrest her." Several officers and TV cameras immediately turned to me. I was wearing tattered clothes, pale-faced and trembling as I pulled a thick stack of documents from my pocket and handed them to the investigator in front of all the officers, reporters, and villagers. "Officer. I am the rightful owner of this land, but I am the real victim." I spoke with a sob, loud enough for everyone there to hear clearly. "These are the land boundary dispute mediation filings I previously submitted to the court, and the temporary agreement I signed with John. The agreement clearly states that this land was forcibly occupied by them a month ago, and I didn't even have a chance to approach it." The investigator took the documents and quickly skimmed the notary seals and timestamps. Moreover, I pulled out an encrypted tablet and publicly played the high-definition infrared video from Chapter 4 shot late at night. The video screen projected on the enforcement vehicle's big monitor was extremely clear. Late at night, John personally drove a heavy tiller to forcibly topple the boundary marker and occupy my land, while Sarah efficiently poured toxic seeds into the soil in batches, their devilish laughter and dialogue echoing clearly from the speakers. "Everyone listen. Look." The gathered villagers erupted into furious cries for justice. "They're the ones who stole our land, planted toxic substances in secret, and now they're blaming a poor girl. This is utterly heinous." In the face of the video and undeniable evidence, John's face turned paper white, his lips trembling so violently that he couldn't utter a single word in protest. The investigator's expression darkened completely, his tone stern. "Mr. John, the evidence is conclusive. You illegally occupied someone else's disputed land without permission and secretly cultivated a forbidden, highly toxic organism, causing a major ecological disaster. Now, on behalf of the State Environmental Protection Agency, I am issuing you an initial eco-damage pre-fine of $24 million and you will be placed under criminal detention." $24 million. The astronomical figure struck John like a thunderbolt. His eyes turned black, he collapsed fully to the ground, and he didn't even notice that his groin had been wetted in fear. Next, the law enforcement officers pulled up the guardrails, several large containment devices and toxic control personnel completely sealed off John's farm and that toxic field, countless seals heavily placed on every door and window of their home. John and Sarah were handcuffed with cold handcuffs, and amid countless flashbulbs and villagers' curses, they were stuffed into a police car like dead dogs. I stood behind the fence in my own yard, quietly watching the police car drive away into the distance. A massive $24 million environmental penalty and a detention order, like two insurmountable mountains, crushed John and Sarah to pieces in an instant. However, for them, the closing of the police car's iron gate did not mean the nightmare was over. On the contrary, this was exactly the start of a total chain break and a plunge into a bottomless abyss. To obtain bail and raise the astronomical prepayment for ecological restoration, John and Sarah, imprisoned in the detention center, were as restless as ants on a hot pot. They issued urgent instructions through their proxy attorney, demanding the sale of all their assets, including the farm that had been running for half a lifetime, 5 heavy agricultural machines, 3 residential properties, and all stock accounts. In their view, although $24 million was an astronomical sum beyond reach, if they could liquidate these assets quickly, they could at least raise $2 or $3 million for bail, pull the person out of the cold cell first, and then drag out the legal battle to delay time. However, when their attorney hurriedly rushed to the town's property trading center and the bank, they were met with a heavy blow. At 9:30 a.m. In the VIP reception room of the town's central bank. The attorney wiped the cold sweat from his brow and handed the asset emergency liquidation authorization signed by John to the bank manager. Manager, Mr. John needs to immediately draw on his business loan credit line and carry out the urgent transfer of the farm's property rights. We have already contacted a buyer. Please unlock the account immediately. The bank manager looked at nothing, simply turning the computer screen toward the lawyer without a word. On the screen, all accounts belonging to John and Sarah appeared in a blinding red, with 4 large characters beside them, judicial freeze. I'm sorry, counselor. The bank manager said flatly, this morning at 8 o'clock we received an emergency asset preservation order from the Municipal Intermediate Court. At the same time, an offshore investment company named Apollo Global Asset Management presented to the court a high-value asset pledge and joint liability agreement signed by Mr. John a month ago. The lawyer was stunned, his eyes almost popping out. What Apollo company? John only borrowed a short-term loan from a local intermediary in town. It seems your client hasn't told you the truth. The bank manager sneered, pulling up a thick electronic contract. The town's credit intermediary is merely Apollo Company's secondary agent. To raise funds for cultivating the gold crown grass, Mr. John not only borrowed $2 million at an exorbitant annual interest rate of 36%, but also signed a cross-default and immediate liquidation of all assets supplement. The agreement stipulates that as soon as Mr. John is involved in any criminal proceedings or is fined by the government for more than $500,000, Apollo Company has the right to freeze and seize all assets under his name, including his family's joint guarantees, without notifying the debtor. This statement struck like a thunderbolt, scorching the lawyer inside and out. The real controller behind the mysterious Apollo Company is me. From the day John first contemplated borrowing to expand the drug fields, I quietly swallowed the town's small lender's bottom layer debt through 3 layers of complex offshore trusts. Every loan term I set for John was forged in gold, but internally packed with deadly poison. What he signed wasn't a loan contract, but a family-wide sellout contract. Before the lawyer could recover from the bank's shock, a deadlier strike followed. At 10:15 a.m. Outside the town court's enforcement building. 2 relatives who participated in funding money, namely the cousins who helped move the drug seeds in the dead of night, are now leading a large group of debt collectors, emotionally overwhelmed, to swarm John's locked farm gate. You animals, John. He lied to us about mortgaging our family's pension and house for this. His cousin shouts hysterically among the crowd, eyes reddened, wielding a club and wildly hammering the iron door. He promised us this was a top-secret project that would double in a month. Now the police have sealed the land and the bank has frozen all our money. Our family will be left sleeping on the streets. Pay back! Let John come out and pay back. The relatives and the creditors scramble into chaos, anger quickly spreading through the crowd. They topple the fences, burst into John's living room that had not yet been sealed by the Environmental Protection Bureau, ripping the precious furniture and high-end appliances to shreds, and even fought violently over the ownership of an old motorcycle, blood streaming down their faces. The once close circle of relatives who followed John to flaunt at me instantly turned into biting, snarling mongrels under the crushing weight of enormous debt. In the detention center interview room, the iron door slammed shut. Behind thick bulletproof glass, the lawyer pushed forward a notice of asset freezing and debt, lit. Debt John and Sarah, you are hereby notified. Mr. John, Ms. Sarah, I'm sorry. The lawyer sighed, his voice full of despair. Apollo Company has initiated compulsory collection. The court issued the asset freezing and auction announcement 10 minutes ago. The houses, land, vehicles, deposits, and even your personal pension accounts under your names have all been legally seized. You now cannot pull out a single penny. What? Sarah screamed piercingly, slamming herself against the glass, her face pale as paper. 1 penny? Then what about our bail money? How do we get out? There is no bail money. The lawyer shook his head, pulling out his service contract. Moreover, since you cannot pay my legal fees, I will formally terminate our engagement from now on. The state government will appoint a free public defender for you. After speaking, the lawyer didn't waste another word, packed his briefcase, and left the interview room without looking back. Come back! You, come back here! John pounded the bulletproof glass with his fists, his knuckles raw and bleeding, the dull thud echoing. His eyes were full of crimson veins, looking like a completely deranged mad dog. He could not understand. He had clearly obtained the secret plan to get rich, clearly taken the back hills for himself, clearly was about to become fabulously rich, so how could he have fallen from a farm owner with millions in assets to nothing, owing tens of millions, and not even be able to pay for a lawyer in just 1 month? That bitch. It must be that bitch. John suddenly seemed to remember something, grabbing the handcuffs and wildly swinging them, screaming hysterically into the air, "She's playing me." From the very start it was a trap. All of this was arranged by her. However, the prison guard walked up coldly, a baton striking his shoulder, forcing him down to the ground, and pressing his head under his foot. "Shut up. Don't you dare talk nonsense here." The cold floor pressed against John's decayed cheek, the intense pain searing through his body. In extreme despair and helplessness, John finally shed tears of remorse and fear. And at this moment, I am sitting in my warm upstairs study, holding a freshly ground hot coffee, quietly watching the house next door on the farm being smashed to pieces by the debt collectors through the bright bay window. The cold wind blows, picking up the scraps of paper on the ground, making the once invincible farm look like a gloomy ruin. Assets frozen, debts piled up, no way to seek help. The day of the court hearing arrived quickly. I dressed in the plainest gray cotton long dress, tied up my hair, and held a worn notebook in my hand, already seated in the first row of the spectators' seats. Today's trial attracted all the residents of the town, even the city's legal channel sent a live broadcast team. Once dazzlingly heroic John and Sarah were now dressed in bulky, ugly prison uniforms, with heavy iron shackles on their wrists and ankles, being led step by step toward the defendant's bench by 2 bailiffs. Their hair wasn't sparse, their cheeks hollow, and the rot scars from toxin corrosion on their skin looked especially lurid under the fluorescent lights. Beside them at the defendant's bench stood 2 others as well, the tyrant lawyer David who had once colluded with them, and John's cousin who had helped move the toxic seeds. To escape exorbitant environmental fines and decades in prison, these former tightly intertwined allies had now in this solemn court completely transformed into a pack of mad dogs tearing at each other, eager to tear the others to pieces. The gavel fell heavily, and the judge's cold voice echoed in the courtroom. The trial begins. In the case of the defendants John, Sarah, David, and others suspected of illegally occupying land, deliberately introducing ecological toxins, and forging legal documents, each defendant and the public defender will present evidence and respond. Before the judge's words finished, the lawyer David, who had remained silent, sprang up first, pointing at John beside him and shouting, "Your Honor. I was forced. I was completely fooled by John the con man. When he first approached me, he claimed he had valid rights to use the land. The supplementary agreement in my hand was all forged by John and forced upon me for stamping. I was simply performing my ordinary duties as a lawyer. I know nothing about the golden crown grass being a poison." Hearing David shift all the blame onto himself, John's eyes instantly widened, veins pulsing with red, bloodshot splotches. "You're talking nonsense. David, you dog." John struggled violently at the defendant's bench. The restraints clanged harshly as he turned his head and spat a mouthful at David. "It was your idea to forge the contract originally. You told me that as long as we scared that dead girl, the back hill were ours. You even took me $20,000 in bribes. Now you want to pour all the dirty water on me alone? You're lying through your teeth." David's facial muscles twitched. He shouted hoarsely, "Your Honor, I have recording evidence. John privately hinted to me many times that if I helped him seize the land, after success he would share 10% of the golden crown grass profits with me. This fully proves he knew from the beginning that the land was planted with highly profitable illegal crops, and he is the mastermind. Before John could retort, his cousin, who stood nearby, completely cracked as well. He fell to the defendant's bench on the spot, crying and sobbing, pointing at John and Sarah, "Your Honor, I want to testify. I want to atone." John not only privately planted poisonous grass, but earlier, to raise loans, he stole our family communal stamp and privately mortgaged all the houses of our families to private lenders. Those poisonous seeds were brought in by Sarah from the back hill. They have nothing to do with us. You treacherous creature. Sarah, upon hearing that even her own cousin betrayed her, screamed, and, breaking free of the bailiff's grip, stretched out her long nails, crazily lunging toward her cousin's face. With a screech, several bloody scratches instantly appeared on her cousin's face. The cousin screamed in pain, then backhanded Sarah with a heavy slap, flinging her to the ground, blood spurting from her nose. Enough! Silence! Court, silence! The judge angrily pounded the gavel, and several guards rushed forward, clamping down on the three who were tearing at each other with batons. The entire courtroom had turned into a farce. The once soaring lawyers, the overconfident neighbor, the greed-ridden relatives, all seeking to shorten their own prison terms, in this public courtroom, did not hesitate to lay bare each other's undergarments, to reveal the dirty, ugly, illegal doing details they had privately committed, one by one, for everyone to see. I sat quietly in the spectator seats, hands clasped on my knees, watching this dog-eat-dog performance with a cold eye. Every piece of evidence they hurriedly produced, every segment of private recordings submitted, formed an invisible, perfect chain of evidence, pinning every member of this criminal gang, one by one, to the evil pillar of the law. They thought they could escape punishment by slandering each other, but they did not realize that this frenzied tearing only made the judge and the jury hate their vile conduct even more. Under the gaze of countless cameras, these villains dragged each other to an irredeemable abyss. I slowly lowered my head, opened the notebook in my hands, and with my pen drew a cold red cross through the names David and the cousin. The heavy gavel proclaimed the final verdict. John was sentenced to 22 years in prison for intentional introduction of dangerous biological agents, illegal appropriation of another's assets, and gravely ecological destruction, and fined $24 million. Sarah, as one of the principal offenders, was sentenced to 15 years. The barbarous lawyer David had his license revoked and was sentenced to 8 years. The involved relatives each received prison terms of varying lengths. On the third day after the trial, the County Land Administration Office and the Court Enforcement Bureau jointly held a public bankruptcy liquidation auction at the adjacent farm site. Because the rear hillside plot in John's family farm had been completely contaminated by the extremely acidic and deadly golden crown grass, the groundwater aquifers were ruined, and experts assessed that it would take tens of millions of dollars to fully restore. In the eyes of everyone, the entire land had become a worthless toxic death zone. The auction drew only a handful of attendees. Even the most speculative real estate agents avoided it, fearing contamination by this astronomical ecological restoration debt. Section 1, including John's seized farm entity, residence, and the polluted rear hillside plot, starting bid, $1. The auctioneer, listless, tapped the wooden gavel, his voice filled with resignation. Is there any bid? The hall fell into dead silence. No one was willing to be the foolish buyer. I, dressed in a sharp black suit, slowly raised my bid paddle, $1. The auctioneer paused, and after confirming there were no further bids, promptly struck the hammer, $1, going once. $1, going twice. $1, sold. With just $1, I legally acquired John's family's farm, residence, and all the land worth millions, entirely into my name. The moment I signed the asset transfer documents, a black government official sedan pulled up at the auction site's entrance. A few top experts in national ecological frontier technology, accompanied by several government officials, strode in. The lead old professor publicly presented a national patent authorization to the media and held my hand. Congratulations, madam. The professor's voice boomed through the on-site microphone. The specialized strong acid soil biodegradation and heavy metal directed chelation repair technology you submitted to our institute a month ago has officially passed the highest national patent certification. According to our lab calculations, by using your exclusive patent and introducing a specific neutralizing strain, the entire toxin of golden crowngrass can be neutralized within just 3 days, and the soil fertility of this land can be increased by more than threefold. The words had barely finished when the room erupted in astonishment. The hundreds of acres previously deemed a toxic death zone had, because of this exclusive patent, instantly transformed from worthless ruins into a nationwide premier high-yield demonstration field. The land prices surged tenfold in a matter of seconds. At that moment, a police car escorting death row inmates and heavy criminals happened to pass by the auction site, preparing to transfer John and Sarah to a distant maximum security prison. The police car slowed at the red light, and behind the iron bars on the window, John and Sarah's two extremely gaunt, bloodshot faces were revealed. I held up the recently signed property transfer agreement and the exorbitant patent certificate, and walked step by step toward the police car. Through the cold iron bars, I looked down upon John and Sarah, crumpled in a corner of the vehicle, manacled and shod with shackles. John, Sarah, can you see it? I bowed slightly, affixed the asset transfer deed to the car window glass, and spoke in a deep, clear voice, the land you lot schemed for, the paralysis toxin you manufactured, even your intent to trample me into the mud to seize it all, it's now completely mine. And I used only $1. John fixed his gaze on the title deed bearing my name, then looked at the patent report in my hand that could instantly detoxify and turn death into gold. His pupils nearly bulged out of their sockets. It was only at this moment that he finally understood the so-called top-secret high-yield plan, those deadly seeds, that deep loan, and even the land's toxic pollution and today's cheap buyback were all my surgical strike, tailored by me for their destruction. It's you. All you. You devil. You planned everything long ago. John, like a desperate beast, violently slammed against the iron bars, handcuffs hammering the car door frames, blood-slick foam spraying from his mouth. You've ruined our whole family. Die a horrible death. Sarah collapsed mentally, crawling onto the car floor and frenziedly ripping out her own hair, emitting harsh and despairing screams. The police lights flashed, a green light glowed. The escort vehicle roared and forcibly carried the frantically roaring John and the despairing Sarah away from this land. As the siren of the last escorted police car faded at the end of the road, the farm next door, which had once been filled with greed, scheming, and screams, finally returned to complete silence. The morning air no longer carried the sharp, sour toxins. Instead, the fragrance of soil after neutralization and restoration filled the air. I wore neat work clothes, held a patented strain spraying device, and personally walked onto the rejuvenated land at the back hills. Following the underground water veins and soil surface, the special neutralizing strains spread rapidly. In just a few days, the formerly morbid deep purple remaining stems of the golden crowngrass withered and decayed, turning into the soil's best natural fertilizer. The strong acids and toxins were completely neutralized, and the land's fertility reached an unprecedented peak. Standing on a high point and looking into the distance, not only the back hills, but also the several hundred acres of John's family core farm, the husbandry base, and the residential area, were now connected into a single whole by towering white fences. On the site of the old, dilapidated house, several heavy construction machines were weaving between modern intelligent greenhouses rising from the ground. Boss, this is the futures contract for the first batch of high-quality organic crops this quarter, and the long-term exclusive supply agreement submitted by the European Agricultural Group. A young senior assistant in a sharp suit stepped up beside me, respectfully handing a thick stack of documents into my hands. Behind him, dozens of employees in standardized uniforms were operating automated agricultural equipment in an orderly manner, and the entire vast and efficient modern agricultural empire was running smoothly at high speed. I took the documents and, at the end of the contract representing tens of millions of dollars in revenue, signed my name with a fountain pen. The barren land that had once driven me to the brink over a few $1,000s in loans had now, under my control, evolved into the state's largest, most technically advanced integrated ecological agriculture industrial park. Just then, the assistant whispered another update, "Boss, regarding John and Sarah in prison, today the Bureau of Justice delivered the latest periodic feedback." I raised an eyebrow, signaling him to continue. John, unable to bear the double blow of enormous debts and a long sentence, clashed violently with a fellow inmate in the first week of imprisonment, broke both legs, and will spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. Sarah, with her mind completely collapsed, has been forcibly transferred to a closed psychiatric monitoring ward, able to stay awake only with medication, continuously repeating your name. The assistant hesitated, adding, as for that lawyer David, whose license was revoked, he faces countless additional lawsuits for multiple falsified evidences, and will never walk out behind high walls for the rest of his life. After hearing this, I showed no trace of emotion, merely waved my hand to signal the assistant to withdraw. The bad people would eventually fall into the graves they themselves dug. In the long remainder of life, endless torment, pain, despair, and regret would become the nightmares that haunted every moment. A wind swept across the vast oasis, and golden waves of wheat rose in the fields. I slowly walked to the tallest old oak tree on the back hill. Sunlight filtered through the dense branches and leaves, shining warmly and intensely on me. The suffocation and despair of being buried alive in cold soil in my past life, along with those bone-deep grudges and venom, finally, at this moment, with the complete destruction of John's family, drifted away like wind, turning into the smallest ashes beneath this land. All who calculated against me were finally punished. All plots and misfortunes were crushed to powder by my own hands. I lifted my head, faced the blinding sun, and stretched out my hand to tear up the list in my hand that recorded the names of all past enemies, letting the fragments scatter wildly in the wind. The past was all prologue, and the shadow hanging overhead has dispersed. I tread upon this vast empire that is entirely mine, and on this land of rebirth and renewal, I have finally begun a completely new life that belongs only to me.